Hello, and welcome to Red Rock Relationships, a podcast about communication. Let's unpack the relationships that we encounter in our daily lives and learn about what makes them tick. And now your host for Red Rock Relationships, Dr. James B. Stein.
All right, that's me. We're back, and we are continuing our conversation on green flags in close relationships. That is, of course, in stark contrast to last season's red flag focus. I'm having more fun. It's less depressing this time around when we're talking about green flags. Today we've got an interesting one, and one that I would describe as very important but often overlooked. We're going to be talking broadly about the importance of self-monitoring and introspection. And to help me do that, I have a men's sex coach and sexologist here, which is definitely a deviation from our normal guest, but I love diversity. And so I'm going to just open the show, Cam, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your background, your expertise, and then we're just going to jump right into it if that's cool with you.
That sounds great to me, mate. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. So give us your elevator speech.
Yeah, I'll keep it nice and concise, mate. So I am a sexologist with a graduate diploma in sexology from Curtin University here in Australia. I've also got an undergrad in psychology, but I've also got experiential trainings in like yoga and meditation and mindfulness practices. And so I'm really passionate about where those two things intersect, particularly as it relates to men and masculinity and sexuality. So I work one-on-one with a lot of male clients who are struggling with erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation. And when I look under the surface of those issues, I find that there's a lot of emotional, psychological, kind of mental stuff going on for them, whereas they think it's just purely physical. And that tends to be what a lot of guys are doing when they look for advice around their sex life issues, I suppose, is how can I fix this at a physical level, when really there's nothing physically wrong with them. There's something emotionally or psychologically going on which is impacting their sex life. So it comes from my own studies, but also from a lot of my own personal lived experience. And I won't go too much into that here. I've shared it in plenty other places on the internet, but just know that I've also got a long history of like going on my own sexual journey, if you want to call it that as well.
Patient zero, if you will.
That's right.
Yeah, well, I'm super glad to have you on the show. And as you kind of alluded to, there is this interplay going on specifically with men, less so, but still there with women, but certainly with men, where there is a conflation between issues that are emotional and psychological with physical issues. And the specific ways in which those things meet, we might have a moment to discuss here. The first thing I want to get to, though, is this focus on emotion that is often neglected by most likely the people that you work with and by society, like generally. The topic for today is like self-reflection and introspection. And so the first thing we should probably do is kind of define it and distinguish it from what some people, specifically men, might consider as like chronic stoicism, or perhaps even as far as rumination. So do you have a take on how we might conceptualize what self-monitoring and introspection are, specifically in terms of what they are and what they are not?
Yeah, so these are some fantastic questions, and you'll forgive me because it's 4:00 in the morning here. I've got a few notes that I took just so I could actually answer these questions without getting too spam. So some working definitions that I kind of thought of and reflected on when you asked me these questions off air was self-monitoring being a bit of a process of observing and adjusting one's behavior as well as thoughts and emotions to, I guess, in response to situations. And I encourage guys that I work with to do like a healthy version of self-monitoring where they're into and attentive to not only what's going on for them internally, but also like responding and reflecting on what's going on with their partner, particularly like in a sexual context, I suppose. Like there's some self-monitoring you can do in the moment during sex, but also during self-pleasure and masturbation. There's some self-monitoring that I get guys to do when it comes to behavioral change as well, kind of from like a therapeutic approach. So I quite like that version of self-monitoring. I recognize that self-monitoring can kind of like tend towards rumination if there's a tendency for like anxious thoughts, I suppose, or getting stuck in obsessing about one particular thing. I often find that with regards to guys who are struggling premature ejaculation or erectile dysfunction as it relates to performance anxiety, for example. They're like really stuck on rumination around what could go wrong, being a failure, sexually speaking, the thing that they don't want to happen actually happening, and then it becoming a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So there's like a healthy balance there. And stoicism, little s stoicism, as opposed to this, stoic philosophy, I suppose, is what I'm kind of thinking of here. And the way that I conceptualize that is just like ignoring or suppressing emotions consistently and continually. This notion of keeping it together or being strong and not showing anything that might be considered weak or soft or unmanly is the way that I kind of think about this idea of chronic stoicism. And I find that a lot with the guys that I work with as well. Many of the conversations I have with them is, like, I've got to be this, I've got to do this. This is what it means to be a man. I can't show emotions. Emotions are kind of seen as womanly or effeminate or feminine, and they don't want to be perceived as that. And so when I get them to do some self-monitoring tasks and introspective tasks where they're kind of reflecting on their experiences, their behavior, the way that they're showing up in their relationship and in their sex life, there is sometimes some resistance of, oh, that's like for women, right? That's not what guys do. There's a little bit of a resistance there.
It's gross. Yeah, it's icky. Yeah. Surely. No, I think that's...
So hopefully that made sense.
No, it makes perfect... At least to me it does. I think you draw a really clean line directly in between the importance of like acting in the moment, preparing for, and then like debriefing versus trying to convince yourself that everything is going to go wrong or that everything is okay when maybe it's not, and how those sorts of like conversations with the self can be harmful if they're not done intentionally and with the purpose of self-growth, as opposed to like for the purpose of ignoring or for the purpose of avoiding. I think that that's the clear delineation that you've made there, and I like it. I'm glad that I asked that question. I feel very clever now for having asked you that question. I'm gonna throw you a little bit of a softball here that I hope will facilitate the remainder of the conversation, which is just briefly, now that we've defined these concepts, can we talk a little bit about why they're important, and then by extension, which groups of people, if any, and this is the softball, which groups of people, if any, are perhaps less likely to engage in this sort of practice and the harm that it could do to those groups?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to put it succinctly, the reason why it's important is because it makes you a better person, right? And again, if I'm using the context of the work that I do, specifically with guys that are in a relationship struggling with their sex life, the importance of introspection and self-reflection and paying attention to like what's coming up for you helps you be a better lover, helps you be a better partner, because you're able to respond rather than react, which is a nice little catchphrase that I like to use in my work, to like your partner's emotions, to what's coming up for you. It allows you to be of, oh, this is the behavior that is maybe causing distress to myself or to my partner. How can I start to make some change there? So from a behavioral change point of view and a personal development or personal growth point of view, it's a fantastic tool, especially if it's being facilitated by someone, or you've got some processes, which I can speak about a little bit later, for helping you go through that introspective or self-reflective journey. So that's the reason why it's important, because it helps you become a better person in general. And then if you want to niche it down into being a better lover or being a better partner, then it's also helpful for that as well. As for the second part of your question, who is not kind of necessarily doing that, I don't want to like name names, but one of the things that I note in my work is guys that have much more of a, I guess their masculine is hegemonic, is what I would use here as the word. Like there's this very, stereotypically traditional idea of masculinity that these guys feel like they have to abide by, there's other ways of framing this. I've heard of the act like a man box concept from Paul Kivel. That's a really useful analogy that I use when I talk to guys. There's this idea that there's this unwritten set of rules that men feel like they have to live by in order to be a quote unquote real man, in order to like uphold this version, stereotypically traditional, whatever language you want to use for it, version of masculinity. And the guys that are really buying in to that are the ones that struggle with the introspection and the self-reflection. They're the ones that feel like they have to be stoic and strong and emotionless and invulnerable and impenetrable as well. I like to use that word. So there's pretty clear, those are the type of guys buying into that narrative and understanding about masculinity who really struggle to do the introspective work.
Yeah, and I think it's important to pause there. Not to say, I've said this once already this week. I can't believe I'm about to say it twice, but like this is a very much a not all men sort of thing, right? But ironically, the type of men who jump to say not all men are usually the type of men who are most susceptible to these ailments. And I think viewing them as ailments is important because when we use phrases like toxic masculinity, the individuals who kind of need to hear what you just said become defensive. And I think if we allow them to position themselves as victims, not interpersonal victims, but like victims of a system that they may not even know they're like engaging in, I think that opens a door to some self-reflection and some into that introspection that allows you to become, I know you talked about being like a better partner, better lover. In the classroom, we often talk about being a more competent communicator, right? And so there's a bevy of skills that can benefit there. I think that it's important to talk about men when we talk about these things because men are institutionally less likely to be trained to do these behaviors. And so we talk about women on this show a lot. This one's for the boys. This one's going to be a little bit more conversations about men. Does that sound right to you? Does that sound like what you encounter in your practices?
Yeah, totally. And, there's things which I'd be interested to get your take on, stuff like normative male alexithymia, for example, like guys' general lack of connection to their emotions. And I think that's partly because there's not a lot of encouragement for men to have conversations about their emotions. I know there was never really any encouragement for me as I was growing up to be in tune with and speak about and express like what's going on for me emotionally, unless I'd had a couple of drinks, for example, and then I don't remember the conversations that I had the next morning. And then there's also some research that suggests that when it comes to interoception, which is this phenomenon of like understanding how emotions feel in your body, noticing that when you get angry, maybe that you also feel tense in your chest or in your jaw. That idea there of linking emotions and psychological experiences to physical experiences and somatic responses, the research suggests that guys are not as good at doing that in general as women are. And so that's a lot of my work as well, is getting guys to link emotional responses to physical responses so that they've got more awareness of what's going on internally for them. And and I find that guys tend to struggle with that in the beginning, but once they have the practices and they do it, they practice it as well, then they get much better at it over time.
You could have just as easily been teaching the section on nonverbal communication that I taught yesterday, where we spoke about those exact behaviors. The literature in nonverbal communication refers to them as action tendencies, the psychological responses that naturally couple an emotional stimuli or stimulus. And women are just better at both doing them and noticing them than are men. And I always tell my students, I say, it's got nothing to do with the human brain, right? It's not like women's brains are built differently. It's just that it is a skill. It is a muscle. It can be trained. And so we learn about these things. Now, I actually want to skip down to another question I had because I think your answer opens the door to it really clearly. When I was raised, my parents, it was the opposite. It was, no, when you're feeling something, you talk about that thing, and it's okay to cry, and it's okay to be sad, and it's okay to be joyful and jubilant. And as I grew up, I encountered channels like media. When I was, younger, it was mostly through like Facebook and YouTube. There was no TikTok, there was no Instagram. But when I was younger, I was encountering these spaces and these places full of people discouraging that sort of behavior. And so my question to you is, at the moment in 2024, what channels or like groups out there exist that are combating this need for introspection and self-monitoring? And do you have any thoughts on why these folks are so invested in detaching, usually men, from making these connections?
Yeah, I mean, the easy answer to this is the general manosphere, which is the kind of online collection of smaller communities, from incel groups to men going their own way to men's rights activists. Groups that have in common kind of two major things: a worldview that is anti-feminist, I suppose, and I would also argue in some instances anti-women, and then have a belief system about what it means to be a quote unquote real man. And there's a lot of stereotypical, hegemonic, traditional ideas about masculinity wrapped up in that belief system. And I recognize, and this comes from a direct observation in my work, like a lot of the guys that I work with, they don't necessarily, or they wouldn't necessarily label themselves as being one of those groups or being part of the manosphere. In fact, some of the guys that I work with, when I use the term manosphere, they're like, I don't even know what that is. So they don't really identify as being within that community at large. But a lot of the talking points that they share with me come from that community. We might call them like red pill talking points. And so I noticed that a lot of that belief system and that rhetoric gets filtered down into guys who don't even know where it's originally come from, but because it feels, and I use feels there like quite interestingly, like it feels right to them to kind of believe that particular talking point. And again, maybe because it's been positioned in a certain way by their favorite social media influencer, or because they haven't like really done the critical unpacking of it to assess whether or not that's actually a viable system to believe in. So I think that's like where it comes from. And the reason why, I mean, there's a couple of reasons why. The first, and I don't want to boil it down all to this, but I think a major one is a lot of the guys who are the influencers in those communities are trying to sell products. They're trying to sell services. They're trying to amass an audience that they can exploit and make money from. And it's pretty easy to make money from people when you keep them in a state of anxiety, or you keep them in a state of fear, or you keep them in a state of constantly feeling like they need to live up to a certain ideal. And if you're selling the trick or the strategy to be that ideal, whilst also keeping that finger on the emotional suppression button, then you've got a good group of gullible people, unfortunately, to sell products to and sell services to. So I think that's one reason. But again, I don't want to boil it all the way down to that. I think there's a genuine belief that this is like what men should behave like as well. And so there's the perpetuation of that belief system, because it's like it is a genuine, authentic belief that these guys have. They honestly think that's the way that the world should work. And so they want to speak about that. Like I have opinions about the way that I think the world should work, and the way that I think men should like explore, their bodies and their sexuality, that I scream from the rooftops if I'm allowed to. So I don't think you can't discount that as well. And then I also think there's and I say this in inverted commas kind of, but like there's the kind of positive aspects of it as well. And the positive aspects I mean are like, people in general, but men specifically, like desire community and desire connection and desire to like be in a place with people who are validating feelings and who are offering guidance and who create a sense of belonging with each other. And a lot of these communities, they kind of do that. And so I think one of the things that perpetuates them discouraging guys from doing the introspection and doing the reflecting is because they're trying to maintain a community. They're trying to maintain connection to men. And a lot of guys find themselves drifting into those communities kind of inadvertently, because some of those spaces do validate their feelings. They do it with a misogynistic worldview, of course, but like they're acknowledging these guys' loneliness and pain and disenfranchisement. And so guys drift into those spaces, and then they're kept there because they're maintaining a like emotional connection to this particular way of thinking, and it becomes like self-reinforcing, I suppose, when you've got all these people around you that are kind of sharing a similar worldview. So I think that's an element of it as well, is the belonging, the sense of community, the sense of validation, which are not necessarily bad things, but it's about finding better communities for these guys, and that's something that I'm really trying to do with the work that I'm doing, is like offer those same three things: validation, community, and belonging, but in a more, we might call it like healthy masculinity worldview type of way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And it makes me think of two things that are very closely related to each other. The first is a concept that I think it was coined by Naomi Klein in her most recent book, Doppelganger, where she talks about this concept of right feelings, wrong facts. Right. And so you've got these individuals or these channels or groups or sometimes grifters, whatever the case, who are taking justifiable outrage, justifiable frustration, and justifiable insecurity, and taking that and distorting it and perverting it and turning it into, like you kind of described, this anti-feminist and at times anti-women sentiment, which when you've got a primed group of primarily young men, it activates them in ways that can be highly problematic. So that's the first thing that I think of. And then the second thing I think of is a phenomenon referred to as diagonalism, which I learned about through the Conspirituality podcast, which is basically just the belief that like all power is conspiratorial in some way. So if there's a powerful group, they are conspiring in some way. And when you put those two things together, you find a group of people who say, hey, men, do you feel like crap? Well, there's a group at the top trying to make you feel that way, and here's how you fix it. You buy my product, or you join my Discord server, or things like that. And so I think that those are like real tangible examples of what you're talking about there, and they can be potentially problematic in a variety of ways,
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think is worthwhile mentioning here is there's research that's looked at kind of the narrative elements of the stories from men on various subreddits, from like red pill exit, incel exit, ex-red pill, for example. And one of the things that is common to a lot of these guys who are exiting those communities and realizing that they kind of got sucked in and that it's not healthy for them to be in those spaces is the process of introspection, is this process of like self-reflection and going, oh, this was how I was feeling. This is how I was behaving. That's actually not appropriate. It's not healthy. It's actually not serving me very well. It's not making me a better person. It's not contributing to the way that I want to live my life. So the antidote, if you will, to that phenomenon of guys getting sucked into those spaces is encouraging self-reflection and introspection. And so I think one of the reasons why a lot of men in those communities are discouraged from doing that is because people that run those communities realize that if guys start to really self-reflect and be introspective and start to have some mindfulness around like what's going on for them, that they'll probably exit and those communities will probably not exist anymore.
Yeah, I don't think I could have brought it full circle any better if I wrote the script myself. We have only a minute and a half or so left, and so in that time I'd like you to attend to my last question, which is maybe we could just stick with one. What is one tangible, observable, noticeable behavior that someone could look for either in a friend or a significant other that would confirm to them that this person is engaging in self-monitoring and or introspection?
Oh man, I can rattle off a bunch here, but like the first that comes to mind is like, firstly, having conversations with a third party, right? That could be a therapist, it could be a coach, it could be, and I think there's an interesting conversation here which you won't get into, which is like, what does therapy look like for men? With a lot of guys that I work with, therapy for them oftentimes is active. They go out and do something. They join a group. They go and talk while they're going on a particular hiking thing, or they go to the gym and then they have a kind of sit down with a chat with the fellas after they go to the gym. Like, it can look very different than just like one-on-one therapy. So I think not getting too boxed in about what that has to look like can also be quite valuable here. But then also little practices like a reflective journaling practice can be quite helpful. Imago dialogue practice, or just like a conversation where you're able to go a little bit deeper with what's coming up for you. Like, if they're engaging in those types of things where they're able to say, look, I realize this is what was going on for me, and here's the thing that I'm trying to do to get better at this. That's a green flag. It might be a green cocktail flag, but and with the opportunity for it to get bigger over time. But those little things would be the stuff that I would be looking out for, particularly in my client, but also as a friend, what the fellas are doing in their lives, if they're being introspective and reflective.
That's perfect, and that's a great way to end it. Now, next time we'll actually extend this conversation and talk about emotional intelligence. But for now, Cam, I really appreciate you waking up at 4 a.m. to be with us.
Thanks, mate.
You've been listening to Red Rock Relationships, a podcast about communication. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time. If you'd like to be on the show or have questions for us, please send us an email to redrockrelationships@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just search Red Rock Relationships. Thank you again. And remember, it all begins with good communication. This has been a production from a podcast studio.